and rights and closures of LGTBI shelters. I call on the authorities to observe human rights standards in all security operations and to promptly and thoroughly investigate all reports of human rights violations. In Tanzania, efforts to thwart election campaigning by the opposition in the pre-election period included intimidation and violence, arrest of opposition members, and media restrictions, including restricted access to the internet and social media. Allegations of unlawful killings, arbitrary arrest, and illegal detention and torture were also reported during and after the election, notably in Zanzibar. Transparent investigation of all these allegations is essential. I'm also concerned by apparent official attempts to deny the reality of COVID-19 in the country, including measures to criminalize recognition of the pandemic and related information. This could have serious impact on Tanzanians' rights to health. I note reports of pushbacks of hundreds of asylum seekers from Mozambique and the DRC, as well as continued reports of torture, enforced disappearances, and forced returns of Burundian refugees. In Mali, I encourage swift action by the transitional authorities to ensure prosecution of the suspected perpetrators of serious human rights violations, including among the security forces. The International Commission of Inquiry on Mali has issued important recommendations, and I look forward to their implementation by relevant states and key actors in order to advance the cause of accountability and combat impunity. I also encourage immediate steps to enhance civilian participation and leadership in the political space, with specific focus on the equality of women and their participation in administrative and legislative bodies. I'm particularly concerned by last year's increase in killings and other serious violations and abuses, as well as the sharply reduced democratic space. In Malawi, mob justice attacks have more than tripled over the last year, according to official police statistics. They appear to include an increasing number of attacks against older women accused of practicing witchcraft, as well as against people with albinism. Attempted abductions of children with albinism have also been reported and are presumed linked to a market for body parts to be used in rituals. I'm also troubled by the significant rise in sexual violence against women and girls recorded in Malawi after schools were temporarily closed last year, as well as a 400% increase in child marriage and teenage pregnancy in some districts of the country. Fear of the pandemic and increasing poverty may be factors in this increased violence, which calls for a stronger and more accountable police force, as well as stronger protection measures. In Somalia, I'm increasingly concerned about repeated attempts to dismantle the already weak legal protection afforded to children and to women, including with respect to sexual violence and child marriage. I reiterate the need for the 2018 Sexual Offences Bill to be adopted without delay in the form approved by Cabinet. In Sudan, I welcome the Joint Council approval of ratification of the Convention Against Torture and the Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. In the Darfur region, incidents of intercommunal violence and other major protection concerns persist. I acknowledge important recent actions by the government to contain the violence, but I also urge prompt measures to ensure accountability for the grave human rights violations of the past, including remedy for victims. Such efforts are especially important given their deterrent impact. The continued recurrence of violence in Darfur points to core grievances, making the full application of the government's reform agenda a matter of urgency. Our office is providing technical assistance to several major institutional reform efforts, and I will continue to encourage international development partners to prioritize support for the reforms. In Guinea, while I welcome the authorities' cooperation with my office in country, the arrest and detention of opposition members and civil society activists on serious charges of undermining the internal security of the state in the context of last year's presidential elections severely undermines the foundation of democratic governance. I call on the government to release all those detained for exercises the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and participation, and to ensure fair trials for those charged with criminal offenses. I also call the authorities to expedite the trials of the common law detainees and to improve their food and health conditions. In the context of COVID-19, I reiterate my call for the release of those particularly vulnerable, including older detainees and those who are sick, as well as low-risk offenders. I remain concerned about the situation in Comoros, including the crackdown on democratic space, with continued restrictions on freedom of expression and of the press, continued and often lengthy detention of civil society activists and members of the political opposition, and unjustified prosecution of journalists. I call on the government to maintain the civic space and uphold human rights and fundamental freedoms. Madam President, protecting civic space and the right of all people to participate are threshold rights. They open up further impacts that build resilience, prosperity, and peace. Today, in every region of the world, people are being left behind or pushed even further behind as the coronavirus pandemic continues to gather pace. They are being excluded not only from development and from opportunities, but from participation in the decisions that profoundly shape their lives and futures. This makes us all weaker. It heightens grievances that are destabilizing. It means we miss perspective and expertise that could inform and strengthen our initiatives. It chills corruption and abuses by silencing feedback. This is why my office, this council, and all other stakeholders in the UN family, in regional organizations, and around the world must speak out against measures that silence civil society. Because working to defend our rights and standing up to support human rights defenders is vital to humanity's future. Thank you very much, Madam President, Excellencies.
Thank you. We shall now proceed with the presentation of the High Commissioner on her reports on the activities of OHCHR in Colombia, Guatemala, and Honduras. We shall also hear the presentation of reports on oral updates on Cyprus, Eritrea, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, as well as the report on the human rights implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. Madam, you have the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, I'm honored to present my office's reports on the human rights situations in Colombia, Cyprus, Guatemala, Honduras, and on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights. I will also briefly update the Council on the situation in Eritrea, as well as on our technical cooperation with Venezuela.
I'll begin with my annual report HRC 4676 on Colombia. In 2020, the office continued to bolster cooperation with the Colombian state and acknowledges the measures taken to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic with a human rights-based approach. We commend the government for the temporary protection announced for Venezuelan migrants. Despite a reduction of the national homicide rate, my office notes an intensification of violence due to the expansion of non-state armed groups and criminal gangs, with grave repercussions for the civilian population. In 2020, received information on 81 massacres, of which we've documented 76, the highest number since 2014. We registered 133 cases of murders of human rights activists, of which we've documented 90. The UN verification mission to Colombia also documented at least 252 killings of former FARC ex-combatants since the signing of the peace accords. We urge the state to redouble its efforts to protect the population, establishing the comprehensive presence of the state in the most affected territories. I welcome the openness of the Interior Ministry to work with my office to bolster the institutional response to early warnings from the Ombudsman. I urge the National Commission for Security Guarantees to adopt a public policy to dismantle criminal organizations. I also urge the state to continue bolstering the Special Investigation Unit of the Attorney General. I welcome significant progress made in terms of transitional justice. That progress and the future publication of the report of the Truth Commission are an historic opportunity to guarantee the rights of victims and to pave the way towards a reconciliation that would allow us to overcome decades of violence and conflict. I'm troubled by protests against the transitional justice system, including legislative proposals to abolish the special jurisdiction for peace. In that light, I urge the effective protection of the state of its institutions, of its members, and of those who compose it. We reiterate the full willingness of my office to support the implementation of the recommendations in my report. In Guatemala, my office stepped up technical cooperation with the state in 2020, as shown in my annual report. Guatemala continues to face systemic structural challenges, in particular poverty, inequality, discrimination, impunity, and insecurity. The social and economic impact of the pandemic have been disproportionate for indigenous peoples, women, and persons with disabilities. I commend the adoption of measures by the government to enhance access to culturally adequate healthcare and provide information in accessible formats and in indigenous languages. I urge the authorities to enhance social protection with greater emphasis on persons in situation of vulnerability. I recognize the pledge of the executive and of the Congress to expand social programs and to increase the national budget to respond to the crisis generated by the pandemic. I urge the Congress to promote a legislative agenda geared towards bolstering promotion and protection of human rights and to avoid the adoption of any regressive legislation. I stress that measures should be adopted to guarantee independent, objective, and transparent elections for judges to the higher courts. In 2020, my office noted an erosion of civic space with growing attacks and intimidation against human rights defenders, including against journalists. I urge the state to adopt measures to prevent attacks and provide protection for those individuals as well as for justice operators. I encourage the authorities to prioritize the strengthening of the Presidential Secretariat of Women, CEPREM, whose announced replacement by a lower-level institution is troubling. We stress that the Presidential Commission for Peace and Human Rights should strengthen its implementation of national activities in this sphere. I would also urge the government to continue cooperating with regional and international human rights mechanisms. I reiterate the full willingness of my office to support the implementation of the recommendations included in my report and to continue working with the government to promote and protect the human rights of all men and women in Guatemala. I will continue now with the situation in Honduras. UNHRC 4675. In 2020, my office stepped up technical cooperation with the entities of the executive economic, social, and cultural rights, the COVID pandemic, as well as the impact caused by the ETA and IOTA hurricanes, have compounded existing obstacles that face the most vulnerable people. We welcome the willingness of the government to abide by the recommendations of my office, including to modify the decree which declared a state of emergency in response to the pandemic. My office registered a total of 665 social protests during the state of emergency. I'm troubled by arbitrary arrests, by the militarization of civilian security, and by the excessive use of force by the security forces in policing the protests. Call on the state to launch a gradual process of demilitarization and strengthening of the civilian institutions in that sector. In 2020, my office noted how human rights defenders, environmental and land activists continue to suffer threats, criminalization of their activities, including murders. We urge the state to expand the civic space and to ensure the right to prior, free and informed consultation with indigenous communities and Afro-Hondurans, bolstering accountability and access to justice for victims of violations of human rights is a priority. I am concerned by the obstacles in accessing justice in various judicial proceedings, including in the case related to the murder of Berta Cáceres. I regret that the state has still not carried out any process of participative consultation to reform the new criminal code or ensure compliance with its international human rights obligations, including those linked to the right to freedom of expression, the rights of women, and to combating corruption. I'd like to emphasize that thousands of people have left Honduras in so-called migrant caravans, and many returns did not comply with the criteria of free will, dignity and security. I reiterate that human rights challenges are part of the structural causes of migration. I'm grateful to the state for its standing cooperation with my office and with the human rights mechanisms.
Señora Presidenta.
President, Excellencies, I am pleased to present this update on cooperation between my office and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. On 10th of March, I will have an opportunity to address the human rights situation in the country. Since my last update, the joint plan of work has been updated and expanded. My team continues to bolster technical assistance, providing also support regarding pre-trial detention and investigation protocols for investigating human rights violations and that of personal integrity. My team worked intensely with the Ombudsman, carrying out 4 capacity building sessions in the last few months. My office visited 7 states and carried out 5 visits to detention facilities since September. I trust that very soon that including we'll be able to visit military facilities and detention centres of the intelligence services. In October, my team proposed to the authorities a protocol for observing judicial hearings that I hope will be adopted. Since my last update, we've formalised a mechanism for knowledge sharing on individual cases and situations of concern. I stress that this interchange should be enhanced with substantive and timely responses and adequate resolutions. I take note of the decision to grant house arrest to Juan Planchat and to allow him to receive adequate medical attention. I also take note of the release of 2 soldiers who completed their sentence, the parole of 12 indigenous persons and the release of a journalist. We also welcome measures taken to provide to certain detainees access to medical tests, and I urge the government to provide follow-up with medical assistance and to share in a timely fashion the medical reports with the lawyers and families. This practice, as well as regular contacts with the members of the family and with lawyers, as well as adequate access to water and food, should be standardized throughout all detention centres. My team continues to provide follow-up together with the Attorney General's office into cases of alleged human rights violations, and I welcome the new charges brought pursuant to the law against torture in the case of the killing of Captain Acosta Arevalo. The Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, UCMs, carried out a visit to the country in February, and I continue to promote additional visits for other mandate holders this year to focus on a broad spectrum of human rights. We are starting the mid-term assessment of the letter of understanding with the government with a view to bolstering our cooperation, expanding our presence, and establishing an office in Venezuela.
I now move to the report on Cyprus. The persisting division of Cyprus continues to hinder the full enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The report continues to highlight concerns with respect to the right to life and the question of missing persons, the principle of non-discrimination, freedom of movement, and the right to seek asylum. Property rights, freedom of religion, or belief, and cultural rights, freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to education. It also emphasized the importance of ensuring a gender perspective to the peace process. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated human rights challenges. Restrictions on freedom of movement rendered the buffer zone effectively impossible, serving as a stark reminder that Cyprus remains a divided island. The effect was particularly acute for individuals and groups in vulnerable situations, including older people, those with disabilities, migrants and asylum seekers, members of religious communities, and Cypriots who were really affected by the protracted division. I note, however, that both sides have accepted many requests to facilitate access for Cypriots to essential services. I commend the efforts of all of those who continue to work to advance the promotion and protection of human rights despite the challenges. They included civil society, religious leaders, and faith-based actors, and many bicommunal technical committees. I urge stronger efforts for mutual dialogue and cooperation, and call upon all parties to work towards the full restoration of human rights to the population of Cyprus. Let me now turn the update on Eritrea, as mandated by Resolution 44/1. The 2018 peace agreement with Ethiopia prompted hope of internal reforms to improve the situation of human rights in Eritrea. But I remain concerned by the lack of tangible progress. I have, however, noted some positive developments in recent months, namely the release of a large group of Muslim men last August and that of 28 Jehovah Witnesses on the 4th of December 2020, who had each spent between 5 to 26 years in prison. In recent weeks, 70 evangelical and Orthodox Christians were released from 3 Eritrean prisons. At the same time, Eritrean authorities have yet to ensure full respect for human rights, in particular the freedoms of expression and opinion, association and peaceful assembly, and religion. I reiterate my call to the Eritrean government